So y'all are champs. Thanks for being here. I know we're all a little bit saturated, but this isn't super heavy or technical, so we'll move through and hopefully, there may not be water in the desert, but there will be banquet food at the end of this presentation. So rest easy. So just quickly about me. Born and raised in Kentucky. I love Kentucky. If you've met me, I've probably already told you that. And come visit. We'll drink bourbon. It'll be great. But I've always been a non-traditional student, so I started working full-time when I was 18, and that's one way to do things. And I also got my undergrad in geography at UK, and now I'm in the master's program, but I also completed the New Maps Plus graduate certificate in digital mapping, which if you're interested in a really solid curriculum all around cartography, web cartography using strictly open source tools, this is the one. So I was brought on to the University of Kentucky a few years ago and at a place called the Human Development Institute. And so the Human Development Institute is a university center for excellence on developmental disabilities. And basically, there's one in every state, by the way. So I think a lot of us here are grappling with cartography and accessibility. These are really great places to connect to directly talk to folks. So I was brought on, HDI, our vision at HDI is that one day the lives of people with disabilities will look like your lives, like everybody else's lives, right? With education and employment and meaningful relationships. But unfortunately, in the past, people with disabilities have been institutionalized, isolated, and just kind of like unnecessarily othered in a lot of ways. So we believe that one day that will look very different, and we're working on that. So again, I was brought on an unrelated project, actually, to mapping accessibility, but I heard that there was this effort to update this old accessibility map, and I asked to go to a meeting. If you're asking to go to meetings, it means you really want to do the thing, right? So I got invited to the meeting, and this map was actually the result of the data was all collected by volunteers over the space of a weekend using paper map segments, and considering what they were working with, they did a really great job of getting basic information. But obviously, technology, of course, shifts, but also if you work on a campus or you're used to being on campus, the built environment just totally changes in that amount of time. So this, we needed to do some work, and I got to do some of it. So if you work at a large institution, the first thing that I would recommend if you're trying to do something is get as many influencers as you can on your side. Thankfully, we had a whole bunch, and that was really great. The Office of the President said there shall be money for this, and then there was. And these other folks, Kentucky Geological Survey, they did the first volunteer mapping, so it was great to have them around. UK Facilities Management are actually the folks that build and manage all of our official UK maps. So obviously very important, also parking and transportation. So we had this goal to update this map, but we knew we needed it to be scalable and sustainable. We didn't want to be in the same fight in the next 15 years, but also integrated, and that was particularly important to me. Because again, often people are unnecessarily othered, and there's no reason why folks with disabilities or physical disabilities need to be going to a separate map somewhere when it can just be available the way that everybody else is finding out information about their space and how to get to class. So our goal changed, and it became to integrate, and thankfully, because we had those partners, we were able to push this forward. Instead of making our own map, we had the people at the table to gather the data and integrate it directly into the typical mainstream campus map. So just a couple ways of how I think about mobility and how I think about sort of the lens I used for creating this data set is that we all experience a range of abilities, and typically when we are talking about accessibility, we're saying it's either wheelchair accessible or it's not. And when you look out in the community, when you look out in the city, there's not just people in wheelchairs and people not in wheelchairs. Everybody experiences different abilities physically. We all experience different abilities cartographically as well. So in thinking of this as a range, how can we collect as much measurements, or as many measurements and as much information as possible to pull on that and visualize it so that we're really able to customize the experience. Not everybody agrees with this, but I feel like this is something that's very true, is that disability is a function of the environment. When I asked my friends with disabilities or people that I work with that have disabilities about the barriers that they experience, I've never had anyone say that it's interior. It's always an exterior thing. It's not, hey, my mind doesn't work like some other people works. It's usually, I'm afraid somebody will make fun of me if I go and do this thing. Or, one of my friends, he said, the bathroom at my favorite bar is totally inaccessible, so I can't stay there very long and hang out with my friends. So, and thinking about that as cartographers and seeing that, in this diagram, that this little icon person doesn't really experience a disability until they experience this sort of resistance in their environment. So how can we provide people with information that they need to reduce that as they move through space? And just very quickly, why accessibility matters. In the US, I think in Canada it's like 13%, but in the US it's 1 in 5 of us. It's the largest minority group. Again, a lot of us are grappling with this. I've heard sort of over this week of thinking about accessibility, and I'm particularly talking about physical accessibility, of course, but there's plenty of work to do, and it's really important that we do it. It's also the only minority group that any of us could be in all of a sudden. So, and community inclusivity and accessibility are important and necessary components of positive learning experiences. I think this is something that's true for NACIS, and why, when people feel included and they feel welcomed, they feel they're engaged, and they keep showing up. So as thinking of that as a university, student success can be directly linked to how connected they are. And if people can't get into class, they're not going to feel too connected, right? So again, we all experience a range of abilities. This was my typical workflow. I was used to building little leaflet maps and doing things in QGIS or QGIS, however. But we're collecting data at the university scale for this other unit. We needed to use Collector, and I'd never used ArcGIS. So this was a whole new world for me. Again, why partners are really important. Suddenly, I'm the coordinator of this project, and I've never done this before. So thankfully, my partners helped me out, and we built a really strong database. Actually, Kentucky Geological Survey uses Collector all the time. They made it super smooth, and they helped me serve up these web layers and bring it down into Collector. And one thing I just wanted to say quickly, I'm not sure how many people know about this, but I asked hey, how do I need to edit? I just need to edit one feature, and I had multiple people collecting data, so I didn't want to bring it there. They said, yeah, bring the file down into the desktop, which I was totally uncomfortable with. And so we started looking for workarounds, and if you put this little admin text in your service URL, you can directly edit that, and it's super snappy. Hopefully some of you, if you guys don't know about that, you can use it because it is such a time saver. So we had our application set up, and I got to hire some students. And this is so crucial in my corporate experience, and obviously in this project. I got to hire 5 students. They were all very, very different, and it made my project so much better. It made me better. It made the data better. It made the final product better. So there's just no way around it. Hire people that don't look like you and don't think like you and don't have the background like you do. So when you start to measure accessibility, first you have to break it down. And when looking at the ADA, it's sort of overwhelming, but if you start to break it down into specific measurements, you can kind of grapple with it. Do not go into a space and try to map all of the, entrances and look at transportation, and you'll just get overwhelmed and you'll miss things. So break it down. Each student, I would work with one student on accessible entrances. They would go measure all the accessible entrances on a quarter of campus. And this made data collection super fast. So once we got things actually set up, we were originally just going to do a pilot area of campus, and we got the entire campus, including the medical facilities, done. Invest in good tools. If you don't have good tools, you don't have good measurements, and create a shared and flexible workflow. So this type of work, it needs to be very standardized. Your measurements have to be the same all the time, no matter who's doing it. But the folks out that are actually collecting, in my case, students, they have great ideas when they're out there. So make sure that your workflows are accessible to them so that they can make changes and they kind of take ownership over that in that way. Also, it just helps make my job a lot easier. And then think about the flow of environments. Obviously, you don't want to be, collecting information on walk paths on campus during a class break. You don't want to be measuring parking spaces when everybody's on campus and all the spaces are filled up. So we started collecting data. Previously, all the parking information was just available in polygons, which wasn't that helpful considering you're supposed to route from accessible spaces through an accessible pathway to an accessible door. So now, I mean, folks can find where the parking spaces are, that's great. But I think where we'll see the real reach is that Parking and Transportation, who again, one of the folks that came on in the beginning of this project, can use this. I built them a separate little leaflet app. They can use this to inform how they're moving spaces and make sure people can actually connect where they're going to where they're parking. Building entrances, just lots and lots of measurements. I just kind of threw that out there to give you an idea of the level of detail we were going for. Even door hardware, for some people, push bar is easier, but grasping a door handle is just impossible. So a lot of very specific measurements. Same thing with curb ramps. So part of visualizing this accessibility information, we did create a dynamic routing feature. So what we learned was routing away from things was actually a lot easier than routing towards things. So it was actually a student's idea. He said, hey, I see all these places that should have curb ramps that don't. I'm going to start collecting it and create a workflow, and he did. And we actually ended up using that to push forward our routing system. Again, just a lot more, a lot of issues that pop up. You don't really think about it until you do, and then when you do, you can't not see it, right? So all of these things are annoying for some people, but for some people it means they can't get to class. So when you're working through this, people are saying, hey, you're mapping accessibility, that's great. Let me see your map. And then you show them the map. I'll move away from this, that hurts my eyes. You make the map, or you show them the map and they're totally overwhelmed. Again, not useful, right? Here's the curb cuts, you can get everywhere now, right? No, not at all. So we all know that we have to make the information meaningful, and this is where our partnership, again, so important, relationships are key, with the facilities information system and our GIS services really pulled through. We were able to migrate the data really smoothly. They did a great job of implementing it. And now we have so this is sort of phase one. We have a few different ways to toggle on and off layers, as well as a dynamic routing service to route from accessible door through an accessible pathway to another accessible door of a building. And I will say that in the future, what I would like to see is that individual user profiles could be set up. So maybe somebody could say, hey, I can navigate one step, but not 10. And if you're on crutches, that's true, right? So that's what we're working towards, and that's why I was so meticulous about getting as much detail. And even down to the pathways, if there's any disruption in concrete that was over 1/4 inch, we recorded it. And so while that's not helpful to see, obviously it's totally overwhelming to see that, for capital improvement plans, it's awesome. And so we're starting to see this information be used, and they can take out a concrete grinder and bump those things out. This is actually really interesting. This actually routes you through 2 buildings. So if you are doing anything like this, include people with disabilities on from the beginning, because they have all kinds of interesting workarounds, and that's something that they helped us figure out. This is just an example quickly about why the routing service is so important. So this is in the upper left here. You walk out the front of the building, you cross the street, you walk into the next building. But if you click the accessible routing service, you actually walk out the back door into a parking garage, down an elevator, over this footbridge, come back over, you cross the street, and you kind of have to zigzag all the way around to the side. So you can imagine as a student how frustrated you would be if you had to figure that on your own. And if you're showing up to meetings or you're showing up to class frustrated and late, it's not good, right? And there's no reason for it. We can do this, and it can help. So, I kind of alluded to this, but maps are very powerful advocacy tools. Previously, if there was a class that was in a building that was not accessible, the student would have to show up early, try to find their way there, get there, see if it's accessible to them or not. And now they have a University of Kentucky product that they can say, hey, this is your product. It says there's not an accessible door. and not have to do any of that legwork. Hopefully, it's not happening a lot, but when you need it, it's really powerful, and it we should be doing that work, not those folks, right? So really quickly, I just want to introduce Wheelmap. If you want to do something in your community, or if you have a group of folks that want to help, Montreal is actually really has a lot of places marked on this map. With any sort of crowdsourcing application, they kind of often there's these silos, and they kind of eventually aren't supported, and then they're not really helpful. But Wheelmap is the opposite of that. All of the data is contributed directly back to OSM from the application, so it stays there, and anybody can get to it. And they actually just got a $1 million grant working from Google, working towards standardizing accessibility spatial data, which is something that we really, really need. So if you're interested in doing something in your own community, and you can, then this is a great tool. And then in QGIS, you can just run like a quick little query, and it'll bring all of those down. You can make your own maps. So that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. We have time for a couple questions before we wrap things up.
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that it was easier to route away from things than to things.
Well,
Can you explain that a little bit?
because we were routing, it was hard to do both at the same time. And so we kind of set up things, and this is something that I have another, with FM Technologies, Facility Management Technologies, I have a roundtable, kind of virtual roundtable I did with them, so maybe that gets into some of the more technical stuff. Because I didn't handle all that personally myself, but I did it kind of on a team, and that's kind of what I was told, actually. But we were setting up, a number of things that to not go towards, and that would move the path. And it was easier just to put everything in that bucket instead of add an additional thing to route towards while you're also routing towards another door. I don't know. Good question, not a good answer. Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is really amazing product. I was wondering how you are addressing people who are blind or low vision and how they can access the map, or if there's an audio version so you can get routing that way.
Yeah, there's not yet, and that's why it's partially why it's phase 1. And so some of that has to do with, I think I can provide some help with that, but the folks that actually maintain the map have to do that. So that's to be continued. Yeah, this was just the initial get the basics out there. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Did you guys have to consider workarounds for hilly areas at all, or is the university relatively flat?
So I actually, no, there's hills, and there's just weird, anything over 5% in a path actually makes the whole pathway inaccessible. So we very, very carefully measured slope and actually created point because we couldn't get a DEM that was granular enough to, and plus you just miss things because there's like overhangs of buildings, and really if it's a 2-foot stretch that's 10% slope, it makes the space not accessible. So to me it wasn't okay to miss those things. So we spent a lot of time measuring, creating points. Yeah.
One last question? There's somebody in the back, then one more here, and then we'll go. Nope, you, yes.
Okay. When you said you sent out students on campus, what did they have in hand? Was it on paper? Or?
No, they used iPads. Yep.
Go ahead, last one.
I saw on one of the maps there was a checkbox for Cat's Path.
Yeah.
Cat's Path.
Go Cats.
Oh.
It's where you walk your cat. No, I'm just kidding. It's basically like a suggested safe route on campus. So they do things like keep basically it's typically well lighted. Recently, we've switched it to when it's accessible, and things like landscaping is lower, so there's not places that that feel sort of intimidating. It's sort of a safe path. You could walk your cat on the safe path.
All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up there.
Thanks,
I think
guys.
this really has come together nicely, as Nick said, a sense of place. So for all 4 of our presenters.